Welcome, guys. Today, I've got what ended up a really long script, very long video I want to give you all today. It's about a new build that I've been playing. Well, new for me. It's not something I dived into until fairly recently. Those who watch my streams will know that we just completed a challenge in which we saw how long it takes to go from a zero-state account to being at the position where we can raid, and Twitch voted on that being a power engineer in the end. So I've been picking it up, I've been looking at it on my main account, I've been hanging around in the Lion's Arch aerodrome and the DPS testing facility for ages, and I kind of wanted to talk to you guys about the build, about my findings of it, to teach you about it, to explain, you know, a little bit of where the meta is right now, but also to highlight what I think is the worst thing about Guild Wars 2 Buildcraft. And yeah, I think I've got quite a lot of different things to say. So it will be a bit of a long video. It will be a bit of a dry video. Hopefully you'll find something interesting about it. I usually hate DPS lab videos. I think they're really boring and you won't ever see me making one, even though I've spent countless hours in there now. I'll try and make what you guys can watch here as interesting as possible. And we're not going to get bogged down in the maths. I just want to show you guys how some things work. So, let's talk about Power Engineer, what it can do. I've played it enough now that I can actually beat some of the accepted top damage on the class, like other people's videos in their aerodromes. I've learned a lot of stuff that I'm quite enthusiastic about. Here's how I would describe a Power Engineer, okay? Now, on paper, it's a very middle-of-the-road damaging class. It's a DPS build, but what's really cool about it since the most recent patch is ArenaNet changed one of the traits, pinpoint distribution. That means now, as an engineer, you can buff the condition damage of yourself and everyone around you. So both condition damage engineers and power engineers actually run this, and it's created a very interesting idea, maybe, where you run a subgroup filled with Condi players for raiding right now, and really there's much less difference in Guild Wars 2 of today than there ever has been in the past as to whether you want to take a power build or a condition damage build. Condition damage became a lot more competitive, and engineer, because it has this special trait, is now also quite competitive too. But I'm talking about a power engineer. So a power engineer is not the craziest damage in the game. It's sturdy, solid damage. It's got good evade on it, and it's got good break bar damage on it. But the main perk of a power engineer, okay, is how simple it is. This is a build that is capable of doing very solid damage with an incredibly basic skill rotation, as in you don't really have to do very much, you just have to focus on very few things, and this lets you, as perhaps a new player or someone who's got high ping or someone who's making calls in TeamSpeak or whatever, it allows you to focus on other mechanics more, on what to dodge and what to play into and what to tell your friends about. So that's what the power engineer is. It's incredibly sturdy. Condition engineer, by contrast, is kind of the reverse of this. Condition engineer is potentially the very best damage in the game on very small enemies, but that one is super situational and complicated to pull off. So hearing this, a lot of you guys might be tempted, dear viewers, to ignore the power engineer altogether and just build a Condi one because the Condi one has higher potential. Well, power builds are actually a lot cheaper to make, and to be clear, I don't play with the best raiders, I don't play with the worst raiders. I'd consider that I play with fairly average people all round. I personally have never actually been out DPS'd by a Condi NG as opposed to my power NG in the kind of groups that I run. Now, not that I've played it a crazy amount, but my point here is that because it's so easy and because it's so sturdy, quite often, realistically speaking, you'll find the power engineers are pulling ahead. And I think that as well, now that ArenaNet have given the go-ahead on damage meters, the player base is going to be a lot quicker to identify these kinds of things. There is nothing bad about a power engineer whatsoever, just because it can be potentially beaten by its Condi brothers. And when I say potentially, it obviously can, but unless you play with elite speed clearers, I think realistically speaking, the power engineer, it's a really strong, solid place, and it's a good build. That's really not what this video is about. I do believe as well that simple rotation classes like this, or like a Hammer Guardian, or even a Thief to an extent, they can exist too. I think that a lot of people laugh at the Power Engineer, and some of this video is going to be me doing a bit of that, at how easy it is. But I think the game is at its healthiest when we have a mix of both the really complicated things and the more simple things. So for those reasons, I really like Power Engineer. I think you guys should give it a shot. I don't think you should be snobs about Power Engineers who seek to join your groups. They really do pull their weight. However, All that said, happiness aside now, I think Power Engineer is also the perfect example of everything that's ever frustrated me about Guild Wars 2 Buildcraft. And as such, I kind of wanted to talk a bit about how it works and what I'd like to see improved by Power Engineer and to teach you guys the place we're in. Because I think if I was an NG main, I would sort of hate the class right now. I'm really not going to focus on this very much, but the one interesting thing about the Power Engineer, both the Condition and the Power Engineer actually, is that the class's inability to run its elite specialization to do better and perform better. For all other classes in all of Guild Wars 2, ArenaNet deliberately power creeped their elite specializations to the point that nearly everyone, regardless of their build, would want to elite specialize and thus pay for the expansion and be excited about the expansion. Scrapper is the 1 out of 9 where that's not the case. Not for Scrapper. Perhaps this aberration is caused by the devs' previous very PvP-centric balance efforts, where Scrapper is unquestionably, and its function gyro, the go-to choice. They are exceptionally strong. But for whatever reason, it's not actually better to play in PvE as a Scrapper. There's not much place for it. That might upset some of you, and we could do some discussion perhaps at a later date about this Scrapper angle. I'm not going to focus on it so much. But for now, what I will say about Scrapper is, in some ways, I think maybe it's okay if it's not meta. I actually think in a lot of respects, when it comes to the future expansions that the devs release, each elite specialization will need a certain niche and a certain capability in different areas. And in some respects, Scrapper might be the best design of all elite specializations right now, in that it genuinely does have a designated place. This is the one that's really strong in PvP right now, and maybe we'll get a PvE placed one in the future, and both can exist alongside one another. Just for practical purposes, I'll leave the elite specialization considerations here at the door. I mean, in all likelihood, that's probably a bad idea. In all likelihood, the developers are probably going to fix most issues I'm going to talk about today with a new elite specialization, and that's the main thing to go on about, but we have no idea how far away that could be or what their considerations are at all. A big part of me would like to see the developers do a big balance pass similar to that of the Lion's Arch update before Heart of Thorns, before the next expansion, and that could then pave the way for later elite specializations and fix a lot of core stuff, but something in my gut says it might never happen. Alright, conceptually, let's just say this. A Power Engineer is one of the coolest things Guild Wars 2 Buildcraft could have to offer, and it's totally on point. Some might argue, right, that an engineer should only ever have Condi. That's the only thematic pairing that matters for this class, because it's got its alchemy, and it's got its burns, and its bleeding, and it's got its poison. But to me, thematically, flavor-wise, it's all about power, alright? I've recently been playing the PlayStation 4 remake of Ratchet & Clank 1, where you do nothing but upgrade firearms to ridiculous levels, and those who have also enjoyed that franchise might know exactly where I'm coming from. Engineer has explosives, big fucking bombs and grenades and raw hard-hitting strikes. It's got rockets and turret detonations, missiles and orbital strikes. Engineer has delayed plastic explosive charges, electrocution and shotgun fire. Power NG is cool. Power NG should be cool, but it's not. Let me walk you through it. I want to show you today that the Power NG, while being cool, could also be so much cooler. Obviously, there's always going to be a best pick in Guild Wars 2 that overshadows the others, a skill or a trade or a weapon. And when we're in that situation, it will always make other options look useless by comparison, but that's not my point here. My point here is that when you make a Power Engineer, it's all of the really fun and flavorful and appropriate and intuitive seeming options that are the wrong ones to take, leading to a really boring playstyle, and it punishes people who don't go quite deep into the theory craft. So let's lay a very basic thing down first for everyone, so we're all on the same page if we don't understand how Guild Wars 2 works. The way that most classes do their damage, the first step very often when you're creating a build, if it's a damage build, is to find the most powerful auto attack that you possibly can, and to use that as your baseline between all the other skills, okay? So the strength of that auto attack, that baseline, has a huge impact on the viability of the build you're making. If damage based on something else doesn't do more than the auto attack, you're never going to use it. You're going to be autoing instead of using that ability. Sadly, 90% of Engineer is full of this stuff. Cool things that aren't better than simply letting the game auto attack. So let's throw an example. Thermobaric detonation is a nice place to start. First thing to understand is that when you're a power Engie, you trait explosives and you get a minor trait called evasive powder keg. And this means whenever you do a dodge roll, as you can see here, you drop a bomb at your feet and it does a bit of damage. So in theory, this might be a really fun aspect of the class that you play into. Lots of classes have dodge roll damage, right? You want to dodge whenever you can so that you hit harder with these special bombs that get placed. But you're doing this at the cost of some endurance. And if you spend your endurance on doing damage, you can't react to scary situations anymore. It'd be a bit like with Daredevil and the fact that they do lots more damage after they dodge, so they auto and dodge. It's kind of a risk-reward situation for the player. Do you spend all of your endurance on creating these bombs for damage, or do you use it only at the exact moment you need it to evade dangerous abilities? Except the developers never made the minor trait work that way. Where a simple auto attack does a good amount of damage, the dodge roll bombs, which can only be triggered much less frequently because you only have a certain amount of endurance, they do even less than the auto attack, meaning dodging is not something you want to ever do, except obviously to evade attacks, and it makes the traits feel almost useless. Now, this wouldn't be too bad on its own, alright? Maybe we're just supposed to view Evasive Powder Keg as a small damage bump on dodge rolls that you'd have to do anyway when you're evading deadly attacks, which is what a lot of the end game's going to be, right? Maybe that's all it's supposed to be, just a nice little perk when you're dodging. It's a minor trait that we're forced to take anyway. It's not like we're making a choice for this, so I don't have any problem with that perspective. That's where the trait Thermobaric Detonation comes in and complicates matter. This is a Grandmaster trait. This means that it's a trait that is as powerful as they get, it's a trait you have to choose, and it's supposed to be build-defining. Thermobaric Detonation does this. It increases the damage of your evasive powder kegs, and it also makes them blast finishes. Excellent, you might think. So, let's run Thermobaric Detonation, and now it's worthwhile to dodge. Clearly, that's what they're going for, right? There are two traits here, and clearly taking both of them must mean we think of it in some respect for the gameplay. But unfortunately, even with the damage bump of a 25% Grandmaster trait, the dodge roll bombs still aren't better than spamming your auto attack. That's right, a Grandmaster traded skill for damage still isn't stronger than letting the game automatically press 1 without you doing anything. There's no risk reward here. It's basically there's two traits that you could just delete from the game. They don't exist. It's stupid to ever think about Thermobaric Detonation. It's basically not there. You might want to consider that we also get a blast finisher when we do our dodge rolls, and this is a fact that does have some quality, but it's also almost entirely ignorable for every facet of Guild Wars 2. Not just raiding, but tons of areas this is useless in. And unless there's a serious change to combo fields, which has not happened for almost 5 years now, it means that we're going to continue ignoring that. Perhaps we can solve this with another new engineer trait that means when you successfully blast finisher of any kind, you get like an extra damage buff or something. That would actually be a really fun synergy, but perhaps run into some other issues, and we're going down the rabbit hole now. Point is, I don't think Thermobaric Detonation is weaker than an auto attack by design because of blast finishers. It's not about that. I think it's because the developers didn't consider the strength of all the different engineer auto attacks because they've got all their different kits. The devs probably saw that the dodge rolls were doing more damage than rifle and pistol autos, and they thought, well, that's good enough, without realizing that it's actually incredibly weak. This situation, by the way, is even further worsened by two more things, alright? Thermobaric Detonation is also bad because through a separate trait, Engineer is also a class that does more damage when it has full endurance. That means that if you took Thermobaric Detonation and tried to use that, you are not only competing with much stronger auto attacks, but you're also killing a full 10% damage modifier on everything else you do because you're now dodging and losing your endurance. And second, this has all been considering the idea that you could do one dodge roll bomb and the same space of time that you could do one auto attack. Like, it's a 1-for-1 pairing? Well, that's not true. In reality, you can get like 2, maybe almost 3 auto attacks in during the space of time it takes to perform a dodge roll and drop a single Thermobaric Detonation keg. So it's not just worse, it's significantly worse. And the final slap in the face with this is this, alright? Even though Thermobaric Detonation, flavor-wise, is the trait that makes sense for an explodey power guy. It is the more fun trait, the more interesting one. Since thermobaric detonation is utterly useless, power engineers end up taking a different grandmaster instead, called shrapnel. This is a trait that means you have a chance to deal bleeds on your explosive hits. Now, this in practice, even though you're a power engineer, you haven't given yourself any condition damage except for the might and pinpoint distribution. This trait is doing more damage than anything else. It gives you about 1,000 more damage every second for free. You don't have to play into that, you just auto-attack, and shrapnel carries you the rest of the way. What's upsetting about this is that we're in a situation where power engineers, who should be feeling distinct in my opinion from condition engineers, are taking the exact same trait as one another for the exact same reason as one another, even though there's ample opportunity to make the playstyles feel different, and there should be no reason for a power engineer to ever care about shrapnel. Now, why shrapnel, a condition damaged trait, exists in a clearly power-influenced line like explosives, I'm still confused about, but maybe that's a discussion for another day. The question is this: why is a condition trait the best trait for power builds to run? Why is a passive, let's ignore this as it works in the background and dumb down the experience trait, the best thing to run either? The solution, I think, is obvious, and it's been obvious since before Heart of Thorns came out. Thermobaric detonation and the evasive powder kegs should do way more damage, enough to make it actually worth using, and enough damage for the to be stronger than shrapnel too. It's not a ridiculous request. This way the playstyle of a condition engineer versus a power engineer would be very different, and both would have their fun. Further, the other trait elsewhere, that engineers do more damage at max endurance, should maybe just be changed to engineers do more damage at less than max endurance, so that those two things don't conflict on a fundamental level. And there you go. Until then, we'll continue to see power engineers taking the same stuff as the Condi ones, which is nothing but missed opportunities, and it sucks. Let's move on to something else. Now, here's another trait, siege rounds. Now, there is, of course, a third grandmaster competing with shrapnel and thermobaric detonation. This is siege rounds, and here the problems continue. Siege rounds is a trait that specifically affects the mortar kit, which most power engineers can actually be running for their elite, and probably are. So mortar kit is pretty cool. It doesn't do any damage for you, but it offers blinds, it offers heals, and it offers condition cleanse. And even if you're pretty good with the water blasting, you can pop people up a bit. Siege rounds is a trait that extends the duration of all of those useful effects. Got nothing to do with damage, but because of that, it does have its uses. It's not frequent that it has its uses, and you would lose your easy damage bump from shrapnel to take siege rounds, but there is a chance you might run it. The other component of siege rounds is what I want to talk about. Siege rounds doesn't just extend the duration of your abilities a little bit, but it also makes the tool belt skill from mortar, the orbital strike ability, it makes that hit twice. It makes it do double damage. Now, this is really flavorful, fun trait. I remember them talking about this with the Lion's Arch update before Heart of Thorns when this was added to the game, and I remember being really excited about traiting this to do the double damage and the various uses that it could come from that. So surely then, if we're a power engineer who cares about that flat damage, and we're playing with a mortar kit, and we have the option for this Grandmaster trait to buff our orbital strike, and we use that orbital strike with alacrity on us, so it's got a shorter cooldown, and we spam it as much as possible. If we do all of this, surely it's worth doing more than an auto attack? Well, no. Unfortunately, pressing 1-1-1-1-1-1-1 is about the exact same damage. It's a hair's difference of damage. You may as well just go with the easier, more basic rotation of pressing 1-1-1-1-1 instead of ever taking that trait and using the orbital strikes. Again, this baffles me. Orbital strike should be hitting far harder than this. If it's ever going to compete with shrapnel, shrapnel can do better than it if you just get a little bit lucky. This is a specific skill that you can only use rarely. It can miss. It's a trait that has a cool and fun effect, and yet it's still barely able to keep up with the Condi trait when we're running power. It's ridiculous. So, I've talked a lot about the auto attack. Let's dive into this a little bit, because some of you guys might be thinking, well, let's just nerf the auto. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the bomb kit. A moment ago, I was talking about how with Guild Wars 2 Buildcraft, you kind of have to establish your baseline, your auto attack that does the most damage. For Engineer, this is the bomb kit. If you're wondering why don't we nerf the bomb kit, Listen to this. The bomb kit is by far and away the best auto attack you can use. It's way better than the grenades. It's way better than the flamethrower, the toolkit, which you can trait to do more damage, but it's still better. It's better than the rifle. It's better than the pistol, and it's better than the elite specialization hammer. All right. The crazy thing to understand about bomb kit is it's not just that all the other auto attacks that are bad, which is why you use it, but it's because power engineer needs the bomb auto. The bomb auto is the only thing remotely competitive and comparable to the other classes' capabilities in the game. Without the bomb auto, or if the bomb auto got nerfed so that now you did want to use thermobaric detonation or whatever, if the bomb auto gets nerfed, power engie would die. No one would want to run a power engineer because the other opportunities that are available there are way too bad. Without this one little skill on all of the arsenal of engineer, without this one skill, the bomb auto attack, everything would fall apart. Power engie needs an auto of that strength. You can't nerf it to, by comparison, make the other things look more potent. Now, the fact that all of power engineer as a build is reliant on this one auto is a little bit of a worrying aspect of engineer design, but let's not focus on that too much. Now, in principle, the idea of bombs and the bomb kit being the biggest damage dealer for flat damage sounds perfect to me as a flavor match, right? Like, you want to be doing all these massive explosions. There's no problem there for me. But then you realize that the only skill on this entire bomb kit that has any reasonable flat damage is the auto. All the other stuff is condition damage based. This annoys me, as I really think that thematically, bombs and the explosion line synergies is best for flat damage. But the world that the designers have given us is that apparently bombs are about condition damage. Worse, we find ourselves being in a position of having the strongest auto attack ability on the entire class be on a kit that has nothing else worthwhile. Now, yes, situationally you can use the immobilize and the blinds, they can be used, but if you want to know why the power engineer does almost nothing but 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, it's not just the stupid trait balance, it's the bomb kit. Engineers are forced into the bomb kit for competitive damage, and then they can't do anything except auto and maybe use their tool belt skills with it. Either bombs are power or condi. I don't think that the devs should be forcing power players into using something that is nearly entirely irrelevant to them. My suggestion? Decide on which it is. Considering that there's more condition damage than power on it right now, I'd say screw it, make the bomb kit condition focus, get rid of that. Bomb auto should probably just be removed for flat damage and have a bit of bleed on there instead. Do the same with the big old bomb on this tool belt, and then you can have a well-designed kit that has some purity of place. Then, once they've done that, ArenaNet should decide what the power kit is supposed to be for engineer. Is it rifle? Is it flamethrower? Is it the grenades? Is it the toolkit, which you can trait to do a bit more damage? Decide which one of those is supposed to be power, and then buff that to meet what the bombs used to do. I think all areas of engineer really seem to struggle understanding what kind of damage they want to be, and that is a serious problem. If I was going to make a decision myself, it would probably be rifle. I think rifle is the best candidate for power. After the bomb auto was made, I'd bump up the rifle auto attack to take its place. This would also add the perk of making the power engineer a comfortable range damage class, while its brother, the condition engineer, is more reliant on being melee with the bombs and the flamethrower fields and so forth. I like the idea of using rifle too because, hey, it's not like many classes have had much reason to run it in the past, and it's got some nice power things on there, the jump shot and the blunderbuss. A final reason I like the idea of offsetting the damage to rifle instead, it relates to skill aftercasts and kits. See, some power engineer players out there who are watching this video, you might already be tempted to point something out. You might be trying to point out to me that you actually can do a lot more than just auto attack and use tool belt skills. See, it turns out that on the rifle, it already has a high damage ability, which is more than the auto attack, the blunderbuss, and the grenade kit also has 3 fairly hard-hitting skills for power players too. So technically, you don't have to auto all the time. You can take the time to periodically drop out of your bomb kit, use the blunderbuss attack, then go into your grenade kit, use the grenade attacks, then go back to the bomb kit and start autoing again. And on paper, this more complicated rotation, and with a bit of individual skill, this actually is a slight damage increase, a very slight damage increase, if you do it perfectly, on paper. but in practice, it's really not worth doing. Even at the golem, where you have nothing to focus on except the damage you do, this takes very precise skill queuing and timing, and you get maybe a split second more damage, and the variance is so minor that what we could be looking at is Frost Spirit RNG and Shrapnel RNG and Weapon Strength RNG instead. It turns out that even though this is a cool idea, the kits just aren't that forgiving to swap around because of their aftercasts. The second you break the bomb auto attack party, you need to be damn on point to make it worth your time to do so. Very small amounts of latency or other factors, like those you'd especially come across when you're actually fighting, will just throw this off majorly and you'll get a net zero for all your efforts. It's just not worth it. And as a result, Power Engineer is one of these really weird things in the game where you can do a lot more complicated stuff and come out the other end at the exact same place you would have been if all you did is auto anyway. On the one hand, this is kind of annoying. On the other hand, again, I do appreciate the place for simple builds to play. And on the other hand, I kind of think that, well, Condition Engineer is already using bombs and grenades anyway. Do we need the Power Engineer to use bombs and grenades? Maybe it's a good thing that it's only a marginal difference running the grenade kit. Like, one issue you see online quite a lot about Engineer is how reliant it is on kits. And that is absolutely true. It's very reliant on kits. But in reality, it's only the Condition Engineers that are required to play a piano and swap all over the place. Power Engineers, by contrast, you actually don't have to run the mortar kit. You don't have to run the grenade kit. You don't have to run, certainly not the flamethrower kits. And I kind of like that there's that opportunity there. So, a moment ago, we were talking about some traits. Now that we've discussed what's going on with the auto, let's move back over to traits for a second. And another really frustrating scenario where we have a boring trait and a really interesting trait, and guess which one the Power Engineer should be using. Let's talk about aim-assisted rocket competing with shaped charge. So, Shaped Charge is a passive trait that gives you 10% more damage to anything with vulnerability. It competes with aim-assisted rocket, which fires a rocket at foes that you critically hit once every 10 seconds. So, in raids, fractals, even open world PvE, nearly anywhere ever, nearly all of your enemies will have at least one stack of vulnerability on them because of the amount of vulnerability that's in the game at this point and your own applications of it. This means that Shaped Charge that gives you more damage under those circumstances is far and away the winner pick by a really long way. The only situation where it might be better to use the much cooler aim-assisted rocket is when you're killing insanely squishy stuff like mowers in the open world and you get that one rocket on your first hit and you can basically one-shot it. So here's the question, why is the super passive, boring trait with less obvious visuals and less obvious synergy and less obvious fun factor? Because don't forget that this rocket itself is an explosion, which procs with a bunch of other explosion-related traits. Why is the cooler one the one that we're not allowed to use? Both traits are simply a question of what's going to do more damage. And one, despite being more fun, is just straight up weaker because of its internal cooldown. Now, some people might suggest exactly that. Buff aim-assisted rocket and just drop down its cooldown so you're firing rockets out all over the place and then maybe it can compete with the 10% damage. But my suggestion would be something else. I don't think that goes the whole way. I think that Shaped Charge, this really boring 10% damage increase to foes with vulnerability trait, should just be removed and its function should be integrated elsewhere. Hey, remember thermobaric detonation and how weak that is? What if thermobaric detonation also was the thing that gave you 10% more damage against vulnerable enemies, and then we actually have space for the aim-assisted rocket and we can run both? This is a classic example of Guild Wars 2 offering a fun idea, and I imagine new players going and specializing and enjoying seeing those rockets flying around, but screwing up the implementation because it's competing with the wrong stuff. Power Engineer would be more distinct, identifiable, and interesting if it ran that rocket. Moving back to utility skills, one kind of cool thing about the Power Engineer is that it actually can and should run a turret skill. Now, this is the rifle turret, and potentially you can run not just the rifle turret, but 2 more as well. But this is kind of frustrating in the way that it works. So it's a pretty common thing to hear people say, oh, turrets are terrible, let's buff them up. And that's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about wanting a fully blown turret engineer to be the best thing in the world. turrets are fundamentally tied to defensive stuff and utility-based traits right now, so perhaps we won't ever see that be changed unless we get a future elite specialization, as I've mentioned before. But my issues with the turret go in a different direction to that. It's not that they're mostly useless, it's the way that they're tuned and what is involved with them that we completely miss out on. See, for those who don't understand, in Guild Wars 2, as an engineer, you can drop a turret, right? That turret will fire and it will do some damage. Then you can also overcharge the turret for a little while, making its effects even stronger. Or you can press F to pick the turret up and you get a much quicker cooldown. Or you can detonate that turret in an explosion that does damage and knockback. There's a rifle turret who can rapid fire, a rocket turret, an earthquake-inducing thumper turret. That's a lot of cool sounding stuff. Lastly, with turrets, you also get a little tool belt skill that you can activate that often has a fairly minor effect if you're not actually using the turret. It's on your bar, but you're not using it. So, how do we find that power engineers utilize their turrets and this rifle turret? Is it by doing all the cool overcharging and stuff that triggers all kinds of explosion trait synergies? Nope. You just press the little tool belt button and ignore the existence of the actual skill altogether. What is this? To put this in realistic terms for you guys, once you've equipped your bomb kit, you've got 2 free utility slots, and you're going to try and figure out which ones do the most damage for you, which is the best skill. And by far and away, the very best one is Rifle Turret. Not because of the turret itself, but because of the tool belt skill. It's called Surprise Shot. Surprise Shot is a super fast, recharging, instant activation ability that you can spam like mad, especially when you have Alacrity. It triggers good damage, it triggers a different trait you have called Static Discharge, and importantly, because Surprise Shot is instant activation, it's not interfering with anything else you do. It's just a freebie. Remember what I talked about with never stopping the bomb auto attack party because of aftercasts and stuff? Well, Surprise Shot gets around that because it's instant activation. You just spam it. It's super strong, and it's kind of a weird, interesting skill too. I wouldn't actually ask for this to be changed too much. But this is why we see power engineers using a turret. Turrets are meta, guys, yeah? But not really, we're not using the turret, are we? Surprise Shot is cool, yes, but why aren't we allowed to drop the turret? Why can't we overcharge it? What about the fun stuff? Well, if you do it, you'll take a damage loss. The reason for this is a couple of reasons. First of all, none of the turrets do any damage anyway, right? You might be able to drop it and it will plink away at someone. You might be able to overcharge it. But this is the equivalent of when you were a kid at school and you'd fire those little spit paper balls at your classmates, yeah? That's what your turrets do in Guild Wars 2. Neither the thumper turret, the rifle turret, nor the rocket turret, nor the elite supply drop, even when overcharged, do anything of worth. Second, okay, when you place the turret, and this is the important part, when you place the turret, you can no longer use your tool belt skill, like Surprise Shot, because it gets replaced with a new one called Detonate. So not only does placing the rifle turret, the turret itself does barely any damage, but it actually blocks you from using Surprise Shot, which is a lot of your damage. So it makes it just a straight up massive loss to use. You're encouraged to equip but never use a turret. Isn't that backwards? Isn't this similar to when warriors were encouraged to build adrenaline but never use their burst skills? Didn't ArenaNet say that this was backwards design themselves? Turrets are almost never worth using for their damage. And yeah, that does include the supply crate. When I was benchmarking this stuff, if you check out the description and look at all the numbers I got under different scenarios, I saw no difference in how quickly the golem died. And that's when I used this elite skill with having full opportunity to hit an unmoving mob for its full duration with Alacrity sped up overcharges. It still didn't do anything. The only time, practically speaking, a player will drop a turret is to do some break bar damage by blowing it up instantly and then going back to doing your Surprise Shot. Either that or for the utility of the net turret. You can actually run net turret, which is pretty cool. During like demos, you can keep prides permanently immobed or wargs at escort. That is fun, but that's the only situation. I'd like to point out here, by the way, that the rocket turret is actually a lot more viable for your third utility slot than most people realize. You're going to run bomb kit, you're going to run rifle turret for Surprise Shot, but you get a final utility, and you can actually, in theory, run the rocket turret. It's not bad. Just as with Surprise Shot on the rifle turret, the rocket tool belt skill isn't that bad, and it's totally viable against the grenade kit. And rocket is one of the engineer's most interesting skills. Look at this thing activate. Look at the arc on this. It's really weird, and it does a lot of damage. But still, the problem remains. We can be potentially using rifle and rocket turret, yet never properly place them down and overcharge them, like Team Fortress 2 engineers and what the developers were genuinely going for. I want to make a point of how deep this goes, okay? Because good engineer players and eagle-eyed viewers of this video might already have thought of something. You might be wondering this: what if you triggered surprise shot, putting it on cooldown, then very quickly dropped the rifle turret, overcharged it, let it shoot a few times, then detonated it, and that detonation skill, by the way, is an explosion that does damage and proc static discharge and stuff, and then you did all of this in such a short window of time that you got back to surprise shot before it cooled down, and then you can surprise shot again, and you haven't actually been technically locked out. In this way, you can fill the cooldown time with actual turret placement. Well, lovely theory you have there. Unfortunately, the turrets, their overcharges, and their detonations are all so weak that when I tested this out, just the half a second it takes to place the turret down, breaking up your bomb auto attacks, and doing this as perfectly as possible, I was still doing less damage than just ignoring the existence of the turrets altogether. Just spam the tool belt, and that's the best thing. Seriously. This is what annoys me. That idea we just had, that's a cool idea. That's a fun thing to execute. That involves actually looking at the skills. But we don't get to do it. Why are these skills so bad? At this point, it feels like they just don't want the more flavorful aspects of this class to be used because it stresses the servers or something. But man alive, this is frustrating. There are a great many potential fixes to this. You could increase the overcharge damage, obviously. You could allow engineers to detonate their stuff with F instead of the tool belt, which means that you don't get your tool belt locked off while the turret is placed. You could allow turrets to inherit their boons and buffs from the engineer that placed them. You could increase the detonation damage when you blow it up. You could make dropping turrets instant activation so that it doesn't interrupt any other stuff. There's so many different things they could do, and for years there have been so many different things they could do, and it's not been done. There are a great many more issues with engineer, missing opportunities, stuff like power wrench, right, which is a trait that increases your ability to heal turrets. Again, very Team Fortress 2-y and has never meant anything. There's heavy armor exploit, which is a trait that gives tons of vulnerability, but just has no place in Guild Wars 2 of today because they power creep stuff like Tempest, applying it on their Glyph of Storms and their air overloads and stuff. It caps far too low. There's even the entire skill category of elixirs, which we could do discussion on, not to mention Scrapper again and its gyros. But I'd like nonetheless just to finish off with one final thing. Another thing that really annoys me, another example of weird buildcraft in the game, and it's Grandmaster traits again. It's the tools line Grandmaster traits. These to me are some of the coolest parts of Engineer altogether, and guess what? We're going to find out about them. So there's 3 Grandmasters. Let's lay them on the line. First, you've got Adrenal Implant, which is 50% more endurance regeneration. Second, you've got Kinetic Battery, which will instantly recharge a tool belt skill after a dodge. So that's stuff like Orbital Strike or Mortar you could instantly recharge. And then we've got Gadgeteer. Gain static charges as you get hit. Then supercharge a gadget skill, overloading its effect and reducing its cooldown. Now, for what it's worth, I think that Gadgeteer, on paper, is one of the coolest traits that they ever put into Guild Wars 2. This is like one of those really classic old trait ideas that super augments some skills you're using. It has the potential to totally change your utilities, and I imagine any new player who comes to Guild Wars 2 and starts playing Engineer would look at that trait and be excited about unlocking it as they level up. So, what do you run when you get to the end of the game? What is the best thing to run? Well, 50% more endurance, of course. The one that you basically pay no attention to. And people run this to make sure that the other trait, deal more damage at max endurance, is active as much as possible. Plus, there's a bit of quality of life, I guess. Oh, but so lame! Now, I've already suggested that we change this endurance trait to be more damage at less endurance, which could mean that people vary this Grandmaster selection up a bit, but that's not my focus, okay? I want to talk about Kinetic Battery and Gadgeteer. They are very flavorful traits. Why aren't they run? Well, Kinetic Battery has the issue of a 40-second internal cooldown. 40 seconds! For PvE? That's insane. Why? This ability could have no cooldown at all, and still it wouldn't be ridiculously overpowered. It would just be interesting now. In fact, with no cooldown at all, and some of my other proposed changes that I've given today, you suddenly have a really interesting dodge build on the engineer who dodges to drop bombs, to get evades, to double cast his tool belt skills. So you're doing all these cool bombs and things as you dodge, buffing your damage, and then you're trying to spam orbital strikes to bypass its cooldown. Imagine that, carefully timing things and just orbital striking as much as possible. That would be fantastic and include some of the most flavorful stuff that they've got. But apparently no. We need a 40-second ICD. You can only do it once every 40 seconds. Oh, I can double surprise shot once every 40 seconds when it would cool down in like 6 seconds anyway. Ridiculous, useless trait just because of that. Why it's there, I have no idea. Moving on, you've got Gadgeteer. This is the one that I like even more in principle. This is actually killed by the canned effects, which, or, you know, what your gadget skills turn into, which simply are not useful enough. Mostly, it's useless crap like, hey, this is going to launch an enemy further, but guess what? You're fighting a boss, and it has a break bar, and it can't be launched anyway, and you're going to do the same break bar damage whether it was overcharged or not. Great. Or should these be changed a little to have a bit of damage focus, at least on some, it would be a much more worthwhile trait. Also, most gadget skills are actually best used for their tool belt abilities instead of the gadget itself. And guess what? Gadgeteer doesn't affect the tool belt versions. So if Gadgeteer didn't just overcharge the utility itself, but it overcharged the tool belt, it would make a world of difference. And it really would, okay? Because speaking of gadgets and their viability, at first you might think, well, no one's ever going to run Gadgeteer because people don't use gadgets anyway, but you should understand this. While the grenade kit is the top proposed community skill to use for max effectiveness, you don't even need to swap and do all the fiddly stuff, by the way. You can just spam grenade barrage and you're good. While a lot of people do run the grenade kit, and can even do good range damage on the grenade kit, and it has its use, you might be surprised to hear that both Throw Mine and Personal Battering Ram, which are both gadgets, are perfectly as viable. There is such a small difference between them, and Throw Mine, in fact, can push out even more damage on big hitboxes or with a little bit of luck. They're like the rocket turret. You can actually use them. They're totally valuable options. In a weird way, this is a sign of good design. It's really rare for Guild Wars 2 that you can change a damaging skill like the grenade kit for the rocket turret or the battering ram or the throw mine and get nearly the exact same result with all of them. In a weird way, the damage is tuned very well here. So here we have some totally usable gadgets for a meta build. They are right on the cusp. I would never sniff at anyone running launch personal battering ram or throw mine in a raiding scenario on a power engineer. They are good skills to use. They're right on the cusp, and yet it's still not smart to use their Grandmaster trait, Gadgeteer. Instead, we find ourselves with a grenade kit, often, that makes us feel more like a Condi Engie, and a totally passive trait that we never think about. The answer here is obvious. Remove or massively reduce the cooldown for kinetic battery and people might start running it and just improve the effects of Gadgeteer. Suddenly these really fun things are being used and suddenly Power Engineer feels distinct from the Condi ones and it's got its good stuff to look into. So there you go, guys. That's what I have learned. That's my dissertation on the Power Engineer. That's what I wanted to share with you guys, wanted to teach you all about. I'd love to hear what some more experienced Power Engies might have to say in the comments. Now, don't misunderstand me, okay? I've enjoyed playing Power Engie, and I do think it's got its place. I also think that sometimes easy builds have their role in the game, but easy shouldn't mean flavorless. I made this video because I've come to believe that Power Engineer is a perfect example of what sucks about Guild Wars 2 Buildcraft, a mire of missed opportunities. And I can't help but feel, if I was an Engineer main player, that I'd be much more frustrated with this. It's not just about whether you can LFG on this, guys, and whether it's competitive, because it totally is and you can. This is about tapping into the class's full potential and fun factor. Something for a very sad and basic reason the Power Engineer just has not hit the mark on. Thanks for watching. Hopefully we'll see some changes to it at some point before another Elite spec comes out. I'd love to hear what you guys think, especially in areas that I haven't touched on, like the strength of kits versus regular weapons and the flaws in Scrapper, which maybe we can do another time. It depends how you guys take to this. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Paid his debt to the Lucky Horseshoe, he was eventually fingered by one of his victims and tried as a thief. His punishment was exile from the kingdom of Kryta. The local authorities blindfolded him and rode him out 3 full weeks before leaving him to fend for himself. Alone, Broken, lost, Saul wandered through a dense forest for several days, surviving on only roots and berries. On the fourth day, delirious with hunger, Saul emerged from the trees to see what he thought was a hallucination. A city of massive towers reaching into the heavens. The architecture was astounding, and the creatures who lived here were unlike any he had ever seen. Walking down into their city, Saul got a closer look at the denizens of this place. They were tall and thin, with strange wing-like appendages that waved about in the slightest breeze. When they walked, their feet seemed